Today, what we're going to do is we're going to be taking a look at the Cold War, but we're not going to look at the entire Cold War, right? We're only going to look at a very, very small part of the Cold War. Now, for those of you, you either have me as a teacher or have watched some of my other streams, I tend to like to look at big processes, right? Long-term things. But today, we're going to zoom in really close on just a 10-year time frame. So really close examination to answer kind of an essential question about the Cold War, which is, who do you blame for the Cold War? Now, it looks like a lot of you haven't gotten to either the Cold War or World War II in your classes, so this will be a fun exercise. This will be a fun exercise. Cool. So what I'd first like you to do, just taking a look at the screen, is look at these two pictures on the left and on the right. The picture on the right has some text in Russian, but I've translated it on the bottom. So go ahead and take a look at these, and you can throw it up in chat. Just what do you see in picture 1 on the left and picture 2 on the right? What are these? What do you see? Some propaganda, yeah? Propaganda and a political cartoon. Russia trying to expand its control. Bread to missiles on the right, showing food is used. Warfare is disguised as food aid. The one on the right talks about Russians dealing with starvation, or Americans dealing with starvation. So you guys are both right. These are both sort of propaganda pictures or a political cartoon, right? And they both deal with a perception of one group to another group. America doing war instead of helping, or the Soviets, and that gentleman with the pipe right there is Joseph Stalin, trying to assert their control over Eastern Europe, right? And so one of the things about the beginning of the Cold War, in this small little 10-year period we're going to look at, is that it's a very unclear period, right? Sometimes historically, you have moments that are not very clear, and sometimes you have two different sides of the story. And so in this case, we're just going to go ahead and dig in and look at both sides of the story, and I'm going to ask you to make a judgment call once we've done reading that story. Right? We're going to use our historical thinking skills, and you're going to go ahead and make a judgment call about the Cold War, right? One of the most influential events of the last 100 years, right? And Mr. Beckman will be able to tell you much more about its long-term impact, but we are still feeling a lot of the effects of the Cold War to this day, so it's something to keep in mind. So, for those who haven't quite gotten to World War II yet, the Cold War grows out of World War II. So what is the Cold War? Just so we have a basis, kind of a grounding, right? So what was the Cold War? It's a series of events from 1945 to 1991, sometimes violent, sometimes not violent, that essentially divided the world into two camps, a Soviet-Russian communist camp and an American capitalist non-communist. Sometimes democratic, but you'll find out when you learn more about the Cold War, it wasn't always democratic, right? The US had a habit of not supporting very democratic people. Stranger Things, yes, they did. If I recall, season 3 had Stranger Things. In Soviet Union was referenced in season 3. That's true, right? Tanya mentioned the Berlin Wall. That's a huge part of the Cold War. We won't touch on that today, but we will talk about another thing Berlin is famous for, right? But in general, one of the things that characterizes the Cold War is it is a competition for world leadership, right? This means things like military alliances, financial aid, which if you caught my stream on the newly developed states, you saw how financial aid could be used by both sides to get people to come over to their side. It also involved a lot of espionage, right? Spies, the KGB, the CIA. A great movie, if you want to get kind of an idea about how sometimes this Cold War espionage worked, would be Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks, which, since we all have lots of time on our hands, might not be a bad thing to do. The picture on the bottom is from Eastern Europe. You know, good question. I'm not entirely sure where the picture on the bottom is from. It looks like it might be Central American guerrillas. One thing to note is that both sides during the Cold War tended to give a lot of guns to whomever they liked more. So, for example, the USA gave a lot of guns to South Vietnam, while the Soviet Union gave a lot of guns to North Vietnam. The picture on the top, that looks like someone's creation from DeviantArt, which is an art creating website. Cool. Alrighty, so that's what the Cold War was. Let's talk a little bit about how we got there. And you can enjoy this lovely propaganda poster from World War II I've put up on the side. So, during World War II, the USA and the Soviet Unions were actually allies, right? Both fighting a common enemy, that was Nazi Germany, right? And during the war, they cooperated very heavily. The USA sent millions of dollars worth of equipment, tanks, guns, food, you name it. And they sent them all over to the Soviet Union to help them fight the Nazis. But by the end of the war, things had changed a little bit, right? The USA had developed atomic weapons, which they used on Japan to end the war, the most powerful bombs that have ever seen. And by that time, in order to defeat the Nazis, the Soviet Union's military had grown to be the largest military in the world. And so we had sort of a new situation on our hands. So who's the guy in the picture right here? Well, I would encourage you to look at what's in the hand that's not holding the pig. What's in the hand that's not holding the pig? Tools. Any specific tools? The scythe, the sickle. It's the hammer and the sickle, which are the symbols of the Soviet Union. That's actually Joseph Stalin. And the pig that he's holding is who? Right? It's supposed to be a metaphor for Hitler, right? So, Joseph Stalin with a roasted Hitler, right? And if you're wondering, yes, Dr. Seuss did make this cartoon. He made a lot of anti-Nazi cartoons. Actually, if you Google Dr. Seuss World War II cartoons, there's tons of them. Something you might want to check out if you got a little time. Anyways, but the point is the USA and the Soviet Union were really good friends during World War II. But as the war began to wind down, and as both the Soviets in the East and the Americans in the West began to crush Nazi Germany, a sort of tension began to develop because the Soviets liberated Eastern Europe and the Americans liberated Western Europe. And then they kind of just met in the middle, right? They sort of just met in the middle. And so my question for you is, how might these facts lead us to think about how there might be a rivalry later on down the road? Why was Germany split? Well, I don't know. Why was Germany split? That's a good question. Why would you split up Germany after World War II? That's a good question. Is the Berlin Wall the place where the US and Russia met in the middle? Not quite. They met a little bit east of Berlin, or west of Berlin, a place called the Elbe River. They wanted to keep Germany from starting World War III. Yeah, that's a big part of it. Planned a long time before they got to Germany that they would divide Germany. They are both major ideologies that eventually fought for influence over Germany and its government would function after the war. An attempt to ease tensions, maybe? Possibly. I think those are all good ideas. Kind of like Germany after the 30 Years' War. It's not a bad connection, actually. A lot of territory got reorganized after the 30 Years' War. So, all good things, all good ideas and suggestions. But it was actually planned long before the end of World War II that Germany would be divided. And so when they finally conquered Germany, they went to their agreed upon positions and said, all right, the Soviet Union is going to get this chunk, America is going to get this chunk, Great Britain's going to get this chunk, and then France is going to get this chunk. And originally France was not supposed to get a part. And then Charles de Gaulle threw such a fit that they had to give him a part. So I will show you guys a map later that shows exactly how Germany was divided. So rest assured, you'll get a visual on that if you're curious. Rest assured. So now I'm going to ask you to read. So This excerpt on the left is from a textbook. It's a textbook, maybe some of you use it. It's called The Earth and Its People. Does anyone have that textbook? I know my school, my site does not use this textbook, but I've tutored some students whose sites use this textbook. Well, it's a very old textbook, but anyways, it's a different one. So you could take a minute and read this. Take a minute and read this. This is an excerpt from this textbook on the chapter of the Cold War. This is kind of an opening to the Cold War chapter. And so go ahead and read it, and just take a second. What stands out to you when you're reading this? The bottom left corner. Bottom left corner. I'm not sure what you mean. That one word. Oh, hallmark. It's the word hallmark. Iron Curtain, Atlantic Charter, hallmark, United Nations. The words in bold. Communist movements, economic cooperation, right? Iron Curtain. An Iron Curtain. The domination of the Soviet Union on increasingly communist movements. When was this written, though? What a good question. A good question. Well, this is a textbook. So I believe the third edition was published in like early 2000. Right? Keeping in mind this is a textbook, and this is not, this is a what? What is it? Is a textbook a primary source, or is it not? I forget. Someone remind me. Right, it's a secondary source, because the author wasn't necessarily there at the time. Nonetheless, even though it's a secondary source, and the fact that it's a textbook, we normally always think about textbooks as just like presenting us with the facts, right? What perspective does this textbook seem to be presenting? An observer's perspective. Not all documents are primary. That's true. You can get secondary source documents on your DBQ. Textbook is presenting a non-biased perspective. Well, maybe. A global perspective, perhaps attempting. Western perspective, well, we got the gamut here, right? Trying not to be biased. Well, we do always try to be aware of our biases. Perhaps the Soviets started it. I don't think you can help being biased. Well, this does come from historical archives. Modern perspective, since it was written not when it happened, but after. Yeah, that's true, right? This is a modern perspective, looking back, right? Sometimes people are biased without being knowing they're biased. That's true. Unconscious bias, that's what we call it. So if we were to assume that there's a perspective or a point of view, right? What point of view might this author be presenting? Keeping in mind what this document is, right? What is this document? This is a textbook, but who's supposed to be reading it? You guys, yeah? No, that's true. It is an American textbook for American high school students. Thank you, Ashwin. Textbook gives the most reasonable perspective. That's true. Textbooks do try to do a good job of balancing as best they can. That the U.S. didn't start this whole thing since U.S. kids are supposed to read it. Well, that is always important, right? Remember, one of those historical perspectives you can do on a DBQ is to consider the impact of the audience, right? Written after the downfall of the USSR, that's also true, right? Who writes the history of the world? The winners. That's true. That's the old phrase, and there's something to it. So, if you had to answer this question, according to this excerpt, who is responsible for the Cold War? If this textbook excerpt was all we had, right? Who's quote unquote responsible for the Cold War? Looks like USSR all the way. They were dominating Eastern Europe. And domination is a fighting word. That's true, right? They use that word domination. Allies are being portrayed as possibly innocent. Okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quick put this up in poll. And as we go along, I believe you can change your answer as we go along. So we'll keep track of, as we go along, this. And so basically, we're going to kind of keep asking this question as we go through the stream. We're going to look at more primary source documents and documents from the time, and just keep asking that question, right? Who's responsible? Can we vote both? Well, maybe not, but if you want to write a paragraph about it, go ahead. Soviets started it, but others contributed as well. Well, Nyana, BYU is important, so if you gotta go, no problem. Alrighty. Any questions before we get going? Anything in general that I could answer before we dive in? Like I said, if you want to know more, and in general, kind of the course of the Cold War and how it went, Mr. Beckman's stream will be much more effective at that. And like I said, there's a link right here. You can go, bookmark it. Yes, it is Unit 7 and 8. This is Unit 7 and 8. The very end of Unit 7, and then pretty much all of Unit 8. How did German intelligence agencies develop? You mean during the war or after the war, Yanking? After the war? Good question. I don't honestly know. But I'm going to go off on a limb and say it's when they had to start dealing with East German intelligence units, specifically the Stasi. All right, cool. All right, then let's go ahead and take a look at 2 speeches. Now, these speeches are actually really, really long, but I've cut them down, right? The speech was actually like a 4-hour speech, but I've cut them down. So this is the speech that the very first document referenced, the Iron Curtain speech, right? And so this is the pertinent parts of the Iron Curtain speech. So this is from Winston Churchill, and he gave this speech in 1946. Let's go ahead and take a read and tell me what stands out to you. The Iron Curtain. Is the Iron Curtain the Berlin Wall? That is an interesting question. The answer is the Iron Curtain is a metaphor that the Berlin Wall later became a really good example of. But when you think about this word Iron Curtain, right, what does this visual image imply? It's a divide, right? Right, so it's a metaphor. So if you look at the first couple words in this speech, he's talking about 2 parts of Europe that represent like a northern part. Stettin is in the north, and Trieste is in the south. A military blockade of sorts, right? Countries taking sides. That's a good part of it. It's a big part of it. An Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. Behind that curtain is the Soviet region. What's a 5th column? What a great question. 5th column is a term for people who are secretly waiting to betray the place they live, right? So for example, if you were a traitor or a spy against your own country, you'd be a 5th columnist. So take a look, consider these 3 things. First off, who's this author? When was this given? And what was this nation's role in World War II? Right? Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Like a sleeper agent. Moscow. That's an odd typo. Yeah, it should just be Moscow. Moscow is the capital of the Soviet Union. He's a British guy, therefore he hates communism. Well, Winston Churchill, believe it or not, actually had a very, very long hatred of communism. And it is right after World War II. And so the Nazis are defeated. Nazis are gone. Churchill was a major rallying figure. That is true. Right? Winston Churchill, for the British people, was like the guy. He stood strong. He was firm. He gave a very famous speech. We're going to fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them in the streets. Right? But we will never surrender. You should look it up. It's called his Never Surrender speech. He also famously took a picture with a Tommy gun, which kind of gave him the impression of being like a boss prime minister, so to speak. He was a strong man of Europe, yeah. So, as a historian looking back at this document, according to Mr. Churchill, who's responsible for the Cold War? His nation was badly damaged. and so he would have been against any domination of Europe. Well, that's true, right? Britain was pretty badly damaged during the war. Any and all communist spies, yeah. It's important to remember that there were communist movements pretty much in every part of the world at this point in human history, right? From the Middle East, parts of Asia, to the United States, there were communist movements everywhere. So his fear was based on that reality. Cool. Alrighty. Well, let's take a look at a slightly different speech given a little bit before this speech. A slightly different speech, but given about 1 month before this speech. So this speech comes from Uncle Joe, aka Joseph Stalin, given 1 month before Churchill's speech. And so go ahead and read this little short speech. Again, the speech was much longer, right? Again, we're talking like a 4-hour speech. Pass the test, right? Just like all of you are going to do. Amen. I've also just had a chance this morning to read that announcement, and so yes, I can see. Blame game. Stalin's just like Hitler. Looking to the future. Yeah, it blames the war on capitalism, right? World War II wasn't an accident. It was a part of the system, man. And pointing out capitalism, which is the basis of the United States and the United Kingdom's economy. So, proved viable. Right? Thank you. Right? It's essentially a proof that the Soviet Union could persist. Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union during World War II with the idea that he literally said something along the lines of, all we got to do is kick in the door of the Soviet Union and the whole house will just collapse. That's how badly run the whole thing is. Turns out it wasn't run that bad. Claimed success from World War II. So it is worth remembering that during World War II, the Soviet Union fought most of the German army. I mean, the USA, we do a lot of, we tend to take a lot of credit for World War II, but it is important to remember the Soviet Union beat most of the German army. Hitler's plan was called Barbarossa, or Barbarossa, named after an old German emperor. Right? And so if you were looking at this document, if this speech was all you had to know about going into the Cold War, this speech and then the entire Cold War, who would you say would be responsible for the coming tensions, right, based on Joseph Stalin's speech here? The entire capitalist world. Stalin pins a lot of his problems on the US, yeah? So we're going to come back to both these speeches in a little bit. We're going to come back to both these, not to worry. But what says you after looking at these now? What says you? Responsibility for the Cold War. Isabel says, I don't think he was talking about the US specifically. He didn't really name drop them. Well, you're right. He didn't name drop them. That's true. That's true. He didn't name drop them. But as is being pointed out, right, using the term capitalism, you were kind of pointing the finger at the US. There's only two sides to a war. Both sides refuse to see reason. Well, I don't know about that. I know it's easy for us to kind of say that it's both sides, but if you really had to pick a side. Obviously, there's no both answer in that toolbar. So let's keep looking. Let's keep digging. So let's talk really quick about the city of Berlin. Now, this is long before the Berlin Wall was built. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961. But we're going to talk about another episode that affected the city of Berlin. And so for those of you who are wondering how Germany was divided after the war, this map right here gives kind of a picture of how the US, Britain, and France and the Soviet Union divided Germany. Now, it's important to understand that while Germany was divided in four, the city of Berlin itself was also divided in four. So you had Germany, 4 parts, and then you had the capital of Germany, Berlin, in 4 parts. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. So, in 1948, an event known as the Berlin Blockade occurred. And what this was the Soviet Union cut off all rail traffic and water traffic and car traffic from the western zones into Berlin. Now, why did they do that? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But the response from the Allies was, we're not going to give up Berlin, right? We're going to fly airplanes there nonstop for 15 months, right? And we're going to bring everything that people need to live. Food, milk, coal, fuel, and even candy for children, right? And we're going to fly airplanes nonstop every day, right? We're going to move 5.5 tons of supplies into the city every single day. Was this during the Potsdam Conference? No, this was after the Potsdam Conference. And yes, that's what the airplane thingies are on the map. Those are the routes taken by the planes to get to and from Berlin from the western zones. So this is the event known as the Berlin Blockade. It's probably in your textbooks, right? I know it's in mine. It's in chapter 36 of my textbook. In the end, the Soviets backed down after 15 months. Berlin was deep in Soviet territory. Yeah, it was. Berlin was deep in Soviet territory. So, the question is why, right? One of the things the textbooks don't tend to talk about is why exactly it was that the Soviet Union decided to just blockade Berlin, right? Something that theoretically could have led to war, right? Because what if the Soviet Union decided to shoot down one of those planes as it was bringing in supplies? Right? That could have led to a world war, a third world war. So why did they do that? Why might they do that? I throw that out to you guys. What do you think? Why might they have done that? To protect their sphere of influence in East Germany, prevent people from leaving. Well, that's more the Berlin Wall, but maybe, yeah. Didn't want to share, to continue to hold their power. Question was, why would they blockade Berlin? That was the question. Stop communication? Maybe. A show of power. They wanted the Western Allies to give up West Berlin. Maybe. Put pressure on Germany. Well, the thing about this is that at this time, 1948, there still wasn't a Germany yet. Germany was still being occupied. So there was no state of Germany. There was only the occupied territory of Germany. To win over parts of Germany? To take over all of Germany and have the Allies leave? Maybe. Considering if you base your perspectives, right, on the previous trend of the USSR, exerting its control over Eastern Europe, then that's not a bad assertion to make. Well, officially, the official reason that was given was the Soviets were protesting the creation of a single currency in the Western occupation zone. So what you have to understand is during this time, the French and the British and the Americans created a new type of money to be used within all of their zones. So the British zone, the French zone, and the American zone would all have a single type of money. They called it a Deutschmark, which was the German currency up until the 1990s. Now they use the euro. A lot of other European countries use the euro, but back then it was called the Deutschmark, which just means German dollar. And so that was the official reason why the Soviets were protesting. They did not like the creation of this new money, right? The idea that the Western allies were going to create a new source of money for Germany, all of their parts of Germany. So on the surface, that kind of seems a little silly. Why would the Soviet Union be upset about a single currency? What's the big deal? It's just money. It's just money. Why would they have a problem with that? They didn't want it to be the same, so there was no complete flow of currency. They were printing their own currency. That's true. The Soviets did have their own currency in the eastern part of Germany that they were occupying. Was it because the currency was German and literally said German money on it? They didn't want the unification of Germany as a capitalist country. Didn't like the fact that the Western allies were all cooperating together. They wanted to secure the German economy for themselves, possibly. I think that's all interesting speculation. What might a unified currency be pointing towards? So what might a unified currency be an indicator of, so to speak? Like if you have a currency, like you decide that 3 different areas are all going to have the same type of money. The unified currency might be moving towards a unified country, perhaps, because remember, at this time, there still isn't a Germany, right? There is the zones of Germany. There's the American zone, the British zone, and the French zone, and the Russian zone, or the Soviet zone, but there's no actual Germany, right? There is not a German government. It does not exist, right? No German government. And yet here are the Americans, the British, and the French saying, we're going to make a new money for all of our zones. And it's going to literally be called German money. So, why might the Soviets be a little bit upset about that? Also, take it back to World War II. Remember, World War II is only 3 years over at this point, right? World War II, we're only 3 years out, right? It's 1948. Are the 3 allies going to try to take over the Soviet part of Germany? Maybe the USSR would lose their influence if there was like a single Western Germany, maybe. Soviets might be afraid. Could be. In Germany, isn't the USSR outnumbered 3-1? Yeah, technically. I mean, there are 3 other occupying powers. So it could be. They do have a large army. If they shared a currency, they could unify a Western Germany under a capitalist state. They would be afraid that their own currency might lose influence. That's a possibility. And a unified Germany might be a direct threat to the Soviet Union. That's a very good one, right? The thing about Germany and the thing about the USSR you have to remember was that the USSR lost probably more than any other nation during World War II because of the German invasion. And so the idea that they're going to have another Germany is a bit of a terrifying thought to many in the USSR. Yeah, about 20 million dead, right? There were more veterans of World War II in Russia right after the war than there were people in the entire country of Mexico at the time, just to give you some perspective. At the time, now Mexico's population is much bigger today than it was back then, and Russia's population is much smaller today than it was back then, so something to think about. Anyways, my follow-up question is then, why would the Allies insist on protecting Berlin? So many deaths. Those deaths are referring to World War II, not the Cold War. A vital city. Yeah, so the thing about this blockade is that in order to get enough food and fuel into Berlin, they actually had to build 2 whole airports that previously did not exist, right? And because they couldn't get any heavy equipment in, because the roads were all blocked, they actually had to fly in bits of equipment, build the airports, and then build more equipment, right? And so Berlin actually, for a very short time, had 3 different airports. Today they only have 2, and they're building a 3rd one that's going to replace those 2. How do they fly and stuff without airports? They had to build the airports. They actually had to build the airports. So this picture up on the right, it says Tempelhof, where the child is standing on the sign. That was one of the airports, and it was right in the middle of the city. So they had an airport literally in the middle of the city, and I know that because I actually used to live in Berlin, and I lived around the corner from Tempelhof. And so the idea being that, you live in this apartment and then you got planes literally coming right over your apartment building to land in this giant airport. Now, today, Tempelhof is no longer functioning. They closed it down in like 2004, I think. And so today it's just a gigantic park. So it's a park, a big open park with concrete runways that people like to race their bicycles down or race their skateboards down. Or sometimes what they'll do is they'll get their skateboard, and then they'll get a giant parasail, and on a windy day, they'll just race their skateboards down the runways with their parachutes, like these gigantic parachutes that catch the wind. It's a very interesting place. If you ever have a chance to visit Berlin, you should check out Tempelhofer Feld. But anyways, that's how determined the Allies were. And some people earlier noted that's power play, and they wanted to make a strong capitalist state, and they wanted to have the support of the people. Right? They wanted to have the support of the people. That's a big part of it. They just gave up Berlin. I mean, what kind of Western powers are you? You just gave up. Is the Deutschmark Germany's current currency? It was the currency until the 1990s. After that, Germany adopted the euro along with about 15 other European nations. The funny thing was they were still actually, banks up until, I think, 2015, were still accepting Deutschmarks. Like if you had them, like if you found them in your home or something, you could still take them to the bank and trade them for euros, right up until like 2015. So, anywho. Alrighty, so blockade of Berlin, right? Sometimes cited as one of the opening salvos of the Cold War. If that's the case, then who's responsible? Still can't decide. Well, there's lots more to see, don't worry. Yes, it was a Stalin thing, yeah. Stalin was still alive at this point. Stalin lasted a long time. Still the Soviets, yep. Okay. Cool. Alrighty. Well, let's talk really quick about alliances. We're going to just kind of breeze through this part. So Mr. Beckman will go over the alliances a little bit more in detail, but in general, what you need to know is that during the Cold War, there were a lot of alliances. But the two biggest ones are the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union and their allies, and the NATO, which was essentially the United States and their allies in Western Europe. Now, what you need to understand about these alliances is they're based on something called the common defense principle. In other words, if you attack one person in the alliance, you attack everybody in the alliance. And so the idea is these are defensive alliances. And so my question is, have we seen something like this before? Like, historically speaking, have we ever seen this? Like World War I, yeah. It's kind of like World War I. Well, history does repeat itself sometimes. The concert of Europe right after the Napoleonic Wars, yeah, that was part of it. Was China part of the Warsaw Pact? No, actually, China was not part of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact specifically refers to like the European allies of the Soviet Union, the territory that they liberated from the Nazis after World War I or World War II, along with Albania. It was actually liberated by the British, but right. So one thing to keep in mind about the Cold War in Europe was that you had these two gigantic alliances just kind of right up against each other. Like, if you look at the map, like, where do they meet? They meet in a few places. How Switzerland, Austria, and Yugoslavia just didn't join. Yeah, they were neutral. They were officially neutral countries. Austria, like, when it finally reformed a government after World War II, basically put in their constitution that they were never, ever going to join any military alliance ever again. And they haven't. Good for Austria. Switzerland, also historically famously neutral. Yugoslavia was lucky. The thing about Yugoslavia in World War II is that Yugoslavia kind of actually liberated itself, sort of. By the time the Russians got there, most of the Germans and the Italians had already left. So, Concert of Europe. That refers to right after the Napoleonic Wars, so like the Age of Napoleon. That was when all the European powers got together and made alliances to make sure France would never be powerful again. So real quick, let's get a quick look at the timeline about how these alliances formed. So, 1946. The Soviets, in their occupation zone of Germany, create a police force called the Volkspolizei. 1948, you get NATO. 1949, you get an actual West German government. So remember that West Germany did not exist during the Berlin blockade. There were still only occupation zones, right? British zone, French zone, American zone. So, but in 1949, you get an official West Germany, an independent country. Later on that same year, in the Soviet zone, you get East Germany. And then a little bit later that year, or I should say 1955, West Germany decides to join NATO, and it begins to build its military. So Germany is building a military. A little bit later that year, only about a month afterwards, the Warsaw Pact is created, and it includes East Germany. But East Germany doesn't actually have a military yet. And so later in 1955 or 1956, East Germany then begins to build its military. Thank you so much, Tanya. Appreciate that. So, was chemical warfare used in the Cold War? Not on any large scale. Some small conflicts did see small use of chemical war. A lot of tension after all these wars, yeah. So, when you look at this timeline, right, about the alliances, what stands out to you, right? What stands out to you about this timeline when we talk about the alliances? NATO came first, that's true. West Germany built their army. What about East Germany? Well, they would build a military too. Soviets were reacting to the Allies. That's true. Germany is split right down the middle. The eastern part joins the Warsaw Pact, and the western part joins NATO. What I find interesting is the distance between the two military alliances, though, right? Notice how far apart, relatively speaking, NATO and the Warsaw Pact are. Right? The different parts of Germany join the alliances that have influence over them. That's true. That's true. Let's take a look at a few primary source documents from both of these alliances. Actually, wait, I want to show you guys something really quick. And I'm going to unfocus the slides. So I have something to show you. So the East German Army is called the NVA, Svenska Nationalvolksarmé, and while being another kind of Soviet army, was kind of basic, kind of a communist military, they did have one really unique thing about their military. They developed a very unique military helmet, right? Of all the military helmets, most nations just use the Soviet helmet if you were in the Warsaw Pact, or they use the American helmet if you were in NATO. But the East Germans built their own helmet, and I happen to have one. So it's very unique in the sense that it's almost like Darth Vader's helmet, right? It just slants directly down, right? It's got a very long kind of back thing, right? Normally today we think of helmets having like kind of a curve, if you will, but this one was just like straight down, right? Little visor on the front, and then just straight down in the back. And so it's kind of cool about East Germany is that they built their own helmets, whereas every other Warsaw Pact country just borrowed the Soviet model. The East Germans built their own helmet, which I always think is pretty kind of cool. Might have inspired a Gundam. Yeah, that's possible. So, statement on the left, statement on the right. Why did the helmet have no symbol on it? Actually, I don't know. Maybe they did have the symbol on it. I don't think they did. It was so recognizable you didn't even need one. Anywho, statement on the left. One of NATO's first secretary generals, aka the guy in charge of NATO, famously said this quote in 1950. Is this going to be on the exam for real life? Oh, definitely. Everything is on the exam for real life. Why is his nickname Pug? Because he kind of had a face like a pug. That's my understanding. And then the statement on the right is from the Warsaw Pact Treaty. So the statement on this statement on the right is all the nations of the Warsaw Pact Treaty. So the Soviet Union and their allies. Nuclear weapons in the Cold War. Well, That sounds like something that Mr. Beckman might be able to address. But in general, nuclear weapons raised tensions but were never actually used. The Warsaw Pact may have been a response to NATO, possibly. Is it because of the unification? Well, think about the dates. When did West Germany form? Think about those dates. Let's go back really quick. When did West Germany form in the timeline? If we look at this timeline. And then when did West Germany join NATO? Interesting. Okay. So I guess what's the connection between West Germany and NATO? Germany will rise again and sponsor World War III. Interesting. Right? It's interesting to note that the Warsaw Pact, imagine a bunch of dudes with different ideologies arming up next door. Wouldn't you be afraid? Interesting. West Germany militarizes, not in response, but because of NATO. The thing about NATO is that Germany was only allowed to have a military again as long as it was part of NATO. The Americans didn't want a kind of an independent Germany running around with a military. So the Americans said, all right, Germany, you can have a military again, but you have to be part of our alliance. Then you can have a military again. Something that could have started World War III. Well, there's definitely a perspective that would agree with you there. East Germany joined the Warsaw Pact and militarized as well. Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, yeah, there's some of that. I think Yang Kang makes a good point in chat, right? Talks about the unknown, right? Would you be afraid? Right? A lot of unknowns. A lot of unknowns here. So, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. But I'll let you put it down in put it down in poll. What do you think? We've looked at some documents. But now we've had a chance to look at all these. What says you? Right? Who's responsible for the Cold War? Get paranoid like the Soviets. Well, maybe. All right. Looks like the Soviets still are maintaining that lead. Both. Well, but if you really had to pick a side, right? Because it's really easy to say both, right? Paranoia on both sides. Then who is the least paranoid? Soviets did more aggravating things. I mean, it's a legitimate question. This is why we ask historical questions, right? There's a ton of other things I could have included in here as well, right? Something to also keep in mind is that those speeches I gave you and those documents I gave you, what about those speeches and the primary sources I presented to you today? What's something to keep in mind about those primary sources? Bias, point of view. They give a particular point of view, but what should you even keep more in mind about them? Intended audience as well. Let's think even more meta, right? We know that every document has a perspective, right? But which documents have you even been allowed to look at today? Well, they are primary sources, that's true. Who selected them? Who selected these documents? I selected them, right? I picked them. There's lots of other things I could have picked as well, right? But I gave you these because I wanted you to see them, right? So I'm biased. Well, not necessarily. I did have an objective in mind, right? I had a purpose, right? I had a purpose. I wanted you to debate the cause of the Cold War, right? So I purposely selected documents that would make it unclear, right? The point is, I could have put a lot more things in here, right? There's tons of other examples, tons of other documents that I could have picked, right? But I picked these ones because I wanted you guys to practice thinking about history critically, right? Why do we study history, right? It's more than just life skills, but it's the capacity for critical thinking and simple awareness. The Cold War is, and still is, was and still is one of the most influential things that we're dealing with today. We're still dealing with a lot of impacts left over from the Cold War. Militarily, culturally, socially, right? And so kind of exploring the beginnings of the Cold War, those early days, a question of responsibility is a good practice in exploration. Primary source documents are reliable, however, they only show one side of the story. Well, a primary source document is as reliable as the author, right? So it's not that one is reliable and one is not reliable. It's just that a primary source document is that author's document. And you just have to keep that in mind when you go forward. Could a DBQ be biased? I mean, the documents selected are the documents selected. But the thing about DBQs is that sometimes in real life, you don't have all the information, right? Especially the older you go back in history. Sometimes you just don't have everything. A broader picture. I don't know if it's possible to have a completely objective perspective, but definitely a broader picture. Was the space race part of the Cold War? Yes, yes, it was. Very much so. Only so much survives through time, yeah. Of course, now with the internet, everything survives, but, you know, something to think about. Okay. All right. Well, if there are any last questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but thanks for joining me on this little exploration of Cold War origin stories. And again, don't forget to check out Mr. Beckman's stream. He will definitely be going over sort of a broader perspective of the Cold War. But I'll go ahead and answer any questions that are remaining. There was an announcement from College Board today, so you may want to go check that out. You can find it on their website about AP testing this year, so you may want to go check that out. Let's see. Where do College Boards talk about its future of grading? Check their website. Did the Soviets ever try to stop the blockade, or did they ever try to stop the importing of goods into Berlin? They did not make a military attempt. The only option they would have had would be to shoot down the planes, and they didn't. They chose not to do that. That definitely would have started World War III. Did the Soviet Union do what it did to subject Germany to the USSR? Yeah, that's a fair assessment. It's a fair assessment. The USSR was definitely afraid of a unified Germany. Okay. Have a good rest of your day.